We were talking about this on yesterday's show, actually. The Deputy Labour Party leader, Angela Rayner, has now written to Boris Johnson. She's demanding answers following these extraordinary reports that a, quote, Sexist of the Year award, unquote, was handed out at a Downing Street Christmas party. I think it was in 2020, during lockdown.
Well, Susanna's down there, isn't she, this morning at
She
Downing Street?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that may well come up as a question there to Boris Johnson himself in about 15 minutes' time. But it comes as allegations of misogyny spread, not just in politics, but in the police, sport, wider public life. So is it time to take action, policy change, and make misogyny a crime in itself, to make it illegal?
Well, joining us now are Parm Sandhu, former Metropolitan Police Chief Superintendent. She says that the police should be tackling misogyny as a crime, a hate crime. And the barrister, former Met Police Inspector and journalist Richard Hendren, who says that it really could risk freedom of expression. So two very opposing views here. Let's start with you. How would you actually apply the law? Where would the line be crossed before something which was just in bad taste, like stupid, like whistling in the street or something, become an actual criminal offence?
I think you do need to take common sense into account, but it is important to actually recognise that that behaviour is unacceptable, and also to record trends and behaviours and wherever they may be, so that they can be tackled in the future. And we're not saying people should be locked up for wolf whistling. However, what we are saying is that that trend or behaviour in a particular location should be dealt with before it progresses to something more serious.
So what would... OK, let's say there's a building site and a number of women report to the local police that every time they go out for their lunch, you know, on their office break, they're wolf whistled. What do you do? OK,
first of all, the question is, do women have the right to walk down the street without being wolf whistled or demeaned or undermined?
They do. Yeah.
They do. OK, so we agree on that. The next point is that the person who's in charge of that site, the building site manager, has a responsibility for his or her staff.
Right.
So what's wrong with them being spoken to and being told, this is what the behaviour is, you need to deal with it, and then to record that until it becomes progressively worse, and then intervention is required.
So that's advice. The police would give advice there, basically. Where would a charge come in? Just give us a few examples of the kind of misogyny that would, in your book, lead to a criminal charge.
The misogyny side of it would be where there are other crimes being committed, and it's an aggravating factor because it makes it worse. Because if you're being caused harassment, alarm or distress because you're walking down the street, and it is because you are a woman or because of your gender or your sex, then that makes it worse, and that's where the aggravating factor side of it comes into account.
It's about the sentencing element of it, isn't it?
It is.
In a way, it's, you know, we were talking about this morning before we came on air, and the idea of a hate crime at the moment based on race, for example. You know, if somebody's punched in the street, but then the N-word is used beforehand in sentencing, and you would know as a barrister, of course, that then would add into how that person is sentenced. And it's interesting to me about misogyny, because I do think that when perhaps there is a case of sexual harassment or worse, if that same person has sent a rape joke on WhatsApp to their friends, then should that then also be counted as a misogynistic crime to add into what is already in law a crime, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, you've got two issues there. You've got whether or not you would create a separate offence that would make those sort of behaviours criminalised per se, or whether you would add it on to the existing legislation of hate crime. So at the moment, you have hate crimes in relation to religion and race are the most obvious ones, and gender, etc. And where someone is motivated by an offence or at the time of committing an offence or immediately after or before, they say something, and often it's a slur. It could be like, you know, you stupid idiot, or go home. And often, in my experience, that is said after a long-running dispute, and it's often a neighbour dispute where there's been a dispute going on for quite some time, and it just boils over. Now, that person often isn't racist or sexist or homophobic, but they say it on the spur of a moment. And what that then leads is an uplifting sentence. So because of that one word, it means that they then have a huge uplift in their sentence, that the courts do not have a power to reduce a sentence and take into account proportionality. So they get a disproportionate sentence in that. But in terms of whether or not we have a separate offence, it's just totally unenforceable. I mean, where do you draw the line? You know, would, for instance, talking about the mother-in-law coming around again, or the wife messing up the dinner, would that be criminal? You're
right, because I think, you know, lots of people... Is there a difference between sexism and misogyny? Because, you know, a misogynist is always sexist, but is a sexist person always a misogynist, right? So that's the issue, isn't it, I think, in that... I remember I was reading something about it this morning that one commentator said that she was at a major literary festival, and before an event about military fiction, so it was, you know, a literary festival, and this is what she wrote in The Guardian. A posh, famous English author smirked to me and said, "What's the difference between a woman and a piece of toast? You can make soldiers from toast," right? She says that's sexist. She doesn't necessarily say that's a crime or that's misogynistic. But I think that we're talking about culture, aren't we? And for young men, and what we say is acceptable, and how... And we've seen from very serious cases like Wayne Couzens, you know, making sexist and offensive jokes can, for some people, be a precursor to something much more serious down the line. So do we not, as a society, need to send out a very strong signal?
We do need to send out...
It's virtue signalling, though, but you're making the presumption...
Is it virtue signalling?
But it is, but you're making the presumption that all violence...
I'm not saying that in
is motivated by... So if we have a look at the Law Commission report that basically recommended not to... include sex as an extra hate crime. There's a number of charities, Rape Crisis UK, the Law Commission, Law Society, that all were very much against it for a number of reasons. One, they said it will drag out trials. Two, it's very difficult to prove.
Right.
Well, rape trials themselves are at 1% of conviction.
And it would add more trauma
in itself.
for the victims. Very difficult to prove because most violence against women is committed in the home, in a situation whereby it's someone's partner, and trying to show that that violence is motivated because of a hatred towards women is very difficult.
Can I just bring it back to the question of basic crime and punishment? Now, we've talked about it being an aggravating issue in another offence. Let's just look at pure misogyny. Let's say you have a company boss who is misogynistic in his treatment of his female work colleagues, the things that he says about them, the decisions that he makes, which are based purely on misogyny. Would you introduce a criminal law to deal with that?
It does have to be dealt with. There's normally laws and regulations within the workplace so that if a woman is treated differently, there's discrimination law that you can use. Also, there's the harassment.
But you make it a criminal offence?
I think it is a criminal offence. It needs to be because this is where we need to... This isn't freedom of expression.
The police are struggling to enforce the laws they already have without adding more...
Who decides where we put the money? Who decides whether or not police have got the resources?
That's an interesting scenario.
What would the penalties be? Let's say it is a law, and let's say a company boss, is found guilty of misogyny. What kind of penalty would they expect to face?
Well, that depends on how strong the law is and the penalties for that law. You can't just say it should be imprisonment or it could be a fine. It could be a ticket. You know, there could be all sorts of penalties. But what you've got to think about is when a person says, go home because, you know, you're from a different country or you're a woman and you can't be a soldier, that is not acceptable. That's not acceptable.
But surely we should focus on winning hearts and minds. And what we've seen, and there is some criticism for the existing hate crime legislation and questions whether actually it achieves the end goal of making society a fairer and juster place. And you know, there's two sides of that debate. But surely we should be focusing on winning the hearts and minds. Because, as you know, we were both police officers, and what we can see in the Met is when you say, you know, these are the rules, you're not allowed to do it, then people just keep their prejudice hidden, but they still display them via other means. So it's really, if we want to change society and we want to make things better for women, then we've got to really win
the hearts and minds. A racist is always
a
racist, despite whatever the law may say, and however they may behave underneath, they're still a racist.
If a racist sees other behaviours and sees a racist being a racist, young people are influenced. And when we're talking about hearts and minds and society and changing society, if you take action...
Misogyny.
Misogyny or racism, because misogyny doesn't walk alone. You're not going to be just a misogynist.
Where do you draw the line?
Why do we have to draw a line? Why do we have to decide, right, we've got money for this, but we haven't got money for misogyny?
The Law Commission said that introducing this as an offence would do more harm than good. Now, what do you say to that?
Well, I don't actually agree. I think it would protect women, young girls who are going to school, colleges,
UK are wrong, are they? When they
I have to say what's interesting about what you were saying there as a former barrister, actually, is that you know, the current hate crime law. And I think, actually, when we see those reports where it says hate crime has gone up by such and such a percent, it does reveal something about our society. And we notice that when it comes to what happened with the footballers. Oh, my goodness, there's racism in the... Well, yes, of course, but people who are not white knew that all along. But what we've had is we've had this veil of, you know, sort of, we're all getting along much better, which we are. But you know what I mean? So I'm saying that in an interesting way, having perhaps a misogyny crime reported, if not necessarily acted on in terms of making it more difficult for the police to convict, it would, I think, show us something more about society, would it not? Would you both agree on that? That it would at least reveal some truth about how deep misogyny goes?
Very briefly.
It would identify the trends and the behaviours that need to be dealt with.
There is a value in it, is what I'm saying, to counter your point.
Well, there may be value, but the cost of doing so, how practical is it? I'd rather the police spent their time enforcing the existing laws without burdening them even further.
All right, well,
It's not about money.
Yeah,
it's about money.
I think it's very fascinating.
Very well argued on both sides, actually. I enjoyed that conversation.